Your home should be safe until the neighbor isn't. A flash in the window, strange noises from an empty flat, or faces watching from the yard yeesh turns comfort into dread. Because once you know someone's watching, safety is gone. Home unlocked. Jordan and his wife Carol had a pretty good life. They were married, had 2 incredible 6-year-old twins, Sam and Robbie, in a nice little corner house that was perfect for them. They had been there for 4 years and had no plans to move. But that all changed because of a neighbor they hardly knew. Their house was on a quiet street, but the house directly behind them was on the intersecting road, mostly hidden by a dense wall of tall trees and bushes. A man named Steve lived next door on the right. He had moved in less than a year before all this started. Jordan had only spoken to him a couple of times. Steve was a quiet man with a thick, almost unintelligible accent, and he never struck Jordan as particularly friendly. His house had 2 upstairs windows that looked directly down into their backyard, but the lights were never on in those rooms, so Jordan just assumed they were unused guest rooms. One scorching hot day in the middle of summer, Sam and Robbie were in their little blow-up pool, splashing and having a water gun fight. Jordan was out back doing yard work, listening to their laughter as he mowed the lawn. At one point, as he was walking toward the detached garage, he happened to glance up at one of Steve's windows. He saw him for just a second, a fleeting glimpse of his face in the window before Steve quickly turned and walked away. It was an odd moment, but Jordan shrugged it off. Later that evening, after the sun had started to set but the heat was still lingering, the kids wanted to go back out and play. Carol was in the kitchen starting dinner, so Jordan went with them. They jumped back in the pool, and he sat on the porch swing scrolling through his phone. Suddenly, the laughter from the kids stopped. He looked up, and Robbie, the more sensitive of the two, came running toward him, his face a little pale. "Daddy," Robbie whispered. "There's a flashing light from the neighbor's window." Jordan followed him to the edge of the porch. Robbie pointed a small, wet finger at one of Steve's upstairs windows. A knot formed in Jordan's stomach. He knelt down and looked at both boys, his voice low and serious. What did it look like? Did it look like a camera flash? They both nodded. "Yes," Sam said. A quick white flash. Jordan's blood ran cold. The kid's innocent fun had been interrupted by something sinister. He didn't even hesitate. "Okay, guys, time to come inside." He dried them off and took them into the kitchen, where he told Carol what they had seen. She didn't even need him to finish. The look on her face mirrored his own gut feeling. "You have to go over there," she said, her voice tight with worry. Jordan walked over to Steve's house and rang the doorbell. No answer. He rang it again and again. Steve's car was in the driveway. He was home. After a few more attempts, Jordan went back to his house. The fact that Steve hadn't answered just made the kid's story seem even more credible and disturbing. Weeks passed, and they tried to put the incident out of their minds, but the unease lingered. Then one night, Carol and Jordan were in bed when they heard it. The quiet scrape of their backyard gate opening and closing. They both sat bolt upright in the darkness. "Go check," she whispered. Jordan grabbed a flashlight, flipped on all the outside lights, and stepped into the yard. Nothing. Nobody. But as he looked around, he noticed the lights were on in Steve's backyard. He walked to the chain-link fence separating their properties and peered over. Just then, Steve emerged from the darkness and walked right up to the other side of the fence. He had been standing there hiding in the shadows. "Do you need something?" Steve asked, his voice flat. "I thought I heard someone in our yard," Jordan said, trying to keep his voice calm. "Have you seen or heard anyone?" Steve just shook his head. Jordan decided this was his only chance to get some answers. "Look," they said, "I have to ask you something. My kids told me they saw a flashing light from your window while they were playing in the pool. It looked like a camera flash. Have you been taking pictures of them?" Steve's reaction was immediate and aggressive. His voice got louder, his face twisted in a look of faux indignation. He started yelling, "How dare you accuse me of something like that? It's a ridiculous accusation." He was right in a way. Jordan had no proof. Steve was just overly defensive. Jordan apologized, mumbled that he was just worried, and went back inside. Carol was waiting for him. He told her what happened, and she just shook her head. "Head's full of it," she said. The final straw came a few weeks later. They were all asleep in their beds when Carol shook Jordan violently awake. He was disoriented at first, but then he heard a terrified scream coming from the kids' room. He flew out of bed and ran downstairs. Robbie was sitting up in his bed, sobbing. Sam was awake and crying too, panicked by his brother's screams. Jordan grabbed Robbie and held him tight, asking what had happened. The boy was shaking. "Someone was at the window," Robbie sobbed. And then there was a camera flash. Jordan's blood ran cold for the last time. Rage and fear blanked his mind. He carried the kids upstairs and put them in bed with him and Carol. With the lights off, he walked to their bedroom window and slowly peeked through a crack in the blinds. Across the way, Steve's house was dark and silent. Jordan scanned each window, eyes straining in the night. And then he saw him. Steve's face, partially obscured by the dark, was pressed against the glass of one of his upstairs windows. He wasn't staring at the house. He was staring directly at Jordan. He knew Jordan had just been in the kids' room. He knew Jordan was looking for him. Jordan snapped. He ran out of the house, across the lawn, and up to Steve's front door, pounding on it with both fists. "Steve, I know you're in there. Open the door, you sick son of a bitch." He hit the doorbell repeatedly. He yelled for him to come out, but Steve didn't. His car was still in the driveway. He was there, but he never came to the door. After 10 minutes of useless rage, Jordan walked back home and called the police. He made a full report, telling them everything. There wasn't much they could do without more evidence, but at least there was a paper trail. Jordan never saw Steve outside again. For the next month, he would sit in the front yard, a magazine in his lap, just waiting for Steve to come out. He never did. Steve clearly knew what Jordan was doing, and he was avoiding him. The kids were terrified to go in the backyard. Jordan and Carol were constantly on edge. Within a month, they had packed up their entire life and moved to a new town. It was the only way to get away from the feeling that they were constantly being watched and the gut-wrenching realization that there had been a monster living right next door. Shadows inside. About 3 months ago, Olivia moved into an apartment with 2 other women so she could attend college. There was a list of things that made the building they lived in not that great. For example, most apartment rooms faced the corridor, where people from the same floor constantly walked left and right to get in or out of the building. So if Olivia kept her windows open, anyone pacing outside could see into her room. But since she spent most of her time at college, and the girls she lived with and most of the neighbors were really nice, the things on that list didn't bother her that much. A few nights ago, while getting ready to go to bed, Olivia heard music playing from somewhere, mostly pop songs from the 2000s. Because they lived in a student-friendly city full of frat houses and the like, she thought nothing of it. There were probably a bunch of parties going on, and the sound was coming from one of them. Or maybe it was just some drunk friends listening to it on the street. She got into bed and let a random video play on her phone so she could fall asleep, as she often did. But as she started to doze off, she began to hear drilling noises. At first, Olivia thought she was just sleepy and hearing things, or maybe it was coming from her phone. But she paused the video and listened closely. There was definitely someone using a drill somewhere nearby. She got up and walked around the apartment feeling confused. It was around 11 p.m., so there was no way someone could still be working. The sound was louder at her bedroom window, so she opened it to check, and quickly realized it was coming from the neighboring apartment, the one closest to her window. At that moment, she realized the music was also coming from there. No one lived in that specific apartment, so her confusion only grew. Then she figured maybe someone had planned to rent it, talked it over with the landlord, and he had arranged for something in it to be fixed. Still, the fact that they were doing it so late into a Thursday felt really strange. She went back to trying to sleep, but they wouldn't stop making noise. Olivia texted a friend and eventually started complaining about it, sending him audio clips and even a video directed at the window where all the noise was coming from. He told her she should call the police because there was no way it was legal for someone to be doing this, especially in a building full of apartments. She decided against it since she just wanted to get some rest, and it was already past midnight by then. She forced herself to sleep through the drilling sounds, but a little past 1 a.m. she woke up again, this time to hammering. Feeling stressed but not ready to take action, she tried to sleep once more, only to wake up again. This time, Olivia didn't even check what time it was. She was totally fed up, so she put on a robe and made her way to confront whoever it was. The window to the apartment was open, so she decided to talk to the people there. The window was located above the stairs, though, so she would have to go down a few steps to get a better view, and she'd look even shorter being seen from there, but that was the last thing on her mind. As soon as she reached the window, most of her courage left her. Inside that room were 4 men, who all seemed to be in their 30s or 40s, and they stopped whatever they were doing to look at her. Now only the song coming from the radio could be heard, and somehow it felt chilling to Olivia that all those other noises had stopped so abruptly, because even though that was everything she had wanted just seconds earlier, she definitely didn't want to be the single thing those 4 men were focused on. Another detail that bothered her, though she didn't think about it until the next day, was the men's peculiar choice of music. It felt creepy to realize that middle-aged men were listening to songs teenagers or even preteens would be listening to. None of them looked shocked to see her. They just had puzzled. "What's that expressions?" Remembering why she was there in the first place, Olivia said, "Excuse me, it's pretty late and most people here have work early in the morning. If it's not too much to ask, can you guys do this some other time?" She was a pretty short and puny 19-year-old who hadn't even thought to put on anything other than a robe. So when 2 of those 40-something men came to the window and towered over her, looking her up and down almost like predators, she froze and felt the hairs on the back of her neck stand up. They were both sweaty and had their mouths agape, and one of them held a hammer that looked quite heavy. They started smiling in a sick, twisted way, and Olivia felt a sudden urge to throw up. Extremely unsettled, she slowly made her way back to her apartment, not taking her eyes off the men, feeling like they might try to grab her when she reached the last step of the stairs and was close enough to the window. As soon as she was out of their view, she dashed to her front door, got inside, and locked it. One of the girls who lived with her was out of town that night, and Olivia presumed the other was asleep, since she hadn't seen her text in the group chat asking if anyone had moved into that apartment. Olivia returned to her room and didn't hear any tools again. In reality, even the radio seemed to have been turned off. She wasn't sure how to feel about that. She wasn't angry, just disgusted and creeped out. She knew she should have called the cops by then, but she was too stressed to deal with that any longer. Checking the time, it was about 2:15. Olivia got into bed again, tricking herself into thinking she wasn't scared, just craving some sleep. Eventually, she passed out. She woke up in the middle of the night again. This time, it was around 3:30 and she could hear no sounds coming from the apartment. Everything was quiet, and that made her uneasy. It was too quiet. She had to have heard or felt something in order to wake up. The silence made her anxious, and she had a feeling that someone might have been on the other side of her closed window. She tried not to think about it, but she couldn't get a peaceful sleep after that. The next morning, as she was going out, Olivia passed the same window and noticed it was closed. It was as if the previous night had never happened, but she asked the girl who had been home with her if she had heard anything. The roommate said she had woken up several times during the night but couldn't get up and do anything because of sleep paralysis. Either way, that confirmed Olivia wasn't delusional. Those people really had been there. But then questions surfaced. How did they have keys to the building for that apartment? Why did it seem like they didn't want to be seen during the day? What were they thinking of doing to her? Or maybe to any passerby? It had been a week, and thankfully she hadn't seen those men again. Still, Olivia had no idea who they were or what they had been doing, and she was honestly scared to even think about the possibility that they might come back or still be lurking around somewhere. The Silent Intruder. Matthew had never been a big fan of the suburbs, but when he and his girlfriend Sarah found a little rental house on Long Island, it just felt right. It was a quiet street, a dead end with a few older houses and a massive wooded basin for drainage on one side. On the other side of their yard, there was an empty lot, basically just overgrown trees and brush that gave them a sense of privacy. Their immediate neighbor, Kyle, was an older guy in his late 60s who kept to himself. The whole setup was pretty ideal. The only thing that felt a little off was the house directly behind them. The house was a two-story colonial, and the upstairs window, a big rectangular one, looked directly over their backyard fence. At first, they didn't think anything of it. People had windows. That was just how it was. It was early October and they were doing their autumn yard cleanup. The leaves were starting to fall heavy, and Matthew and Sarah were out there for a couple of hours every day, raking and bagging. That's when Matthew first started to notice them. Two people, a man and a woman, both middle-aged, standing at that upstairs window. At first, it was just a fleeting glance. They'd look up and they'd be there, sort of like mannequins just staring down. He'd pretend not to notice and keep raking. But every time he looked back up, they were still there, and their focus was unwavering. It was weird. It started to get on their nerves. Sarah especially felt it. She'd get tense and whisper, "They're watching us again." One afternoon, a heavy fog rolled in, a thick gray blanket that made everything feel still and silent. Matthew was out back by himself, just finishing up, when he looked up at the window. And there they were, the same two figures, motionless. He felt the flash of frustration mixed with a creeping unease. Deciding to confront the weirdness head on, he stopped raking, stood up straight, and gave them a friendly wave. A big, open-palmed, hey there kind of wave. He even smiled, trying to break through whatever invisible wall was there. They didn't move. They didn't wave back. Not a single twitch or shift in posture. Their expressions were completely flat, and Matthew could feel their eyes on him through the mist. The whole interaction, or lack of it, felt more unnerving than if they'd simply ignored him. He felt like he was being studied, not just observed. After a solid minute of this staring contest, he felt too weird to continue. He dropped the rake and went inside. The whole thing was starting to make their backyard feel less like a private space and more like a stage. That evening, they talked about it, and Sarah suggested they just go over and introduce themselves. It was a simple, logical solution to a very illogical problem. Matthew was reluctant, but she convinced him. They decided to walk around the block and approach the house from the front. They rang the doorbell, expecting to see one of the two people from the window. Instead, the door cracked open just a few inches. A younger guy, maybe in his early 20s, peered through the gap. The house was pitch black behind him, and the way he stood, half hidden in the darkness, was deeply unsettling. Sarah, being the more outgoing of the two, started the conversation. "Hi, we're your new neighbors. We just moved into the house behind you." The guy didn't say anything. He just stared with a blank expression. His energy felt tight, almost aggressive. Matthew jumped in. "Hey, sorry to bother you. I was just wondering if you live with anyone else. We've seen a man and a woman upstairs a few times." The young man's eyes narrowed slightly. "No, it's just me." Matthew felt his heart sink. "Oh, okay. We just noticed a couple of people at the window upstairs looking out back, and we thought we'd say hello." The man just shook his head, a quick dismissive motion. "I don't know who you're talking about." The hair on Matthew's arm stood up. The guy was either lying or something was profoundly wrong. There was no way both he and Sarah had imagined this. They mumbled something polite and started to back away. As they turned and walked down the driveway, Matthew sneaked a glance back. The man was still there. The door cracked just enough to show half his face, watching them walk away. The feeling of being watched was stronger than ever. They hurried back to their house. The first thing Matthew did was go to their bedroom upstairs. It had two windows, and one of them faced that house. Peering through a small gap in the blinds, he saw them again. The man and woman, standing at the window, still as statues. Matthew felt like they knew he and Sarah had just been to their house, like they were waiting for him to look. The sight sent a cold wave of dread through him, and he slammed the blinds shut. That night, they spent hours talking about what to do. The logical next step was to plant some trees, maybe a line of tall arborvitaes to block the view. But it was already late fall. The ground was getting hard. Planting season was over. They were stuck. They'd have to get through the winter with those two watching. A couple of nights later, around 11 p.m., they were in bed trying to watch a movie when they froze. A quiet, rhythmic tap, tap, tap was coming from downstairs. They held their breath, listening. It got louder. Tap, 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 tap. "What is that?" Sarah whispered. It was coming from the back of the house. Matthew told her to stay in bed and went downstairs. The sound came from the window that faced the backyard. The blinds were down, but he could hear it clearly now. The distinct dull sound of a knuckle rapping on the glass. He stood there in the living room, his heart hammering against his ribs, just staring at the window, too scared to move. He flicked on the back floodlight. The knocking stopped instantly. He didn't dare look out. He just stood there for a few seconds in the sudden silence, then rushed back upstairs. He lied to Sarah, telling her he had scared someone away. He didn't want to admit that he had been paralyzed by fear. They both knew, though. It was them, the people from that house. 2 weeks passed, and they hadn't seen the figures at the window. They hadn't heard any knocking. But one night around 2 a.m., they were woken by screaming from the house. They opened their window, and though the sound was muffled, it was clear. A man's voice, raw and furious. A woman's voice, high-pitched and panicked. It sounded like a fight, something truly violent. It was so loud it carried through 2 sets of closed windows. And then, as quickly as it started, it stopped. Silence. They wanted to call the police, but what would they even say? That their strange neighbors screamed and then went quiet? They didn't know if anyone was hurt or what had happened. They just lay in bed for hours, listening to the silence, wondering what could possibly be going on over there. Matthew had no idea what was happening in that house, and honestly, he wasn't sure he wanted to know. Every night he found himself looking out their bedroom window, checking if the figures were there, just standing, watching, and he was terrified to find out what might happen when they decided to stop.